It was the sort of May morning that made even the vicar's dahlias look smug. St. Mary Mead basked in springtime perfection, hedgerows freshly trimmed, the scones warm from the oven, and the vicar's wife orchestrating her annual garden fete with a faintly military precision. Beneath the billowing bunting and soft hum of polite conversation, the village moved like clockwork. Teacups clinked, parasols twirled, and the women of the parish committee kept the jam stall under tight control. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her customary dove grey with a modest lace collar, sat quietly under the shade of a lilac bush, knitting, needles clicking gently. She rarely missed the fete. Not for the tea or the competition, though she had won Best Victoria Sponge 2 years in a row, but because she always found it informative. People, she often said, revealed more in pleasant weather than they ever meant to. The hum of gossip had begun the moment the bride arrived. Verity Hunt. 23, hair like spun gold, an engagement ring that could anchor a lifeboat, and the kind of smile that women of a certain age found just a little too knowing. She was new to St. Mary Mead, recently returned to stay with her aunt, Mrs. Adelaide Crocombe, a retired opera singer of grand manner and dubious taste in wallpaper. Verity had been due to marry one Mr. Jonathan Simmons, solicitor's son and heir to the local paper mill, in a fortnight. Today, however, she was at the garden fete, radiant in white muslin, laughing at nothing in particular. "Doesn't she look like a bride out of one of those women's magazines?" murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, trying to peer over her lorgnette, without actually using it. "Pity about the whisperings." "What whisperings?" asked Miss Hartnell, far too quickly. "Oh, you know." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned closer. "Rumours. That she was once engaged to someone else. A soldier, they say, disappeared in rather odd circumstances. Abroad, of course." Miss Marple said nothing. She merely adjusted the tension in her yarn. Verity herself was moving between tables, smiling, graciously unaware or perfectly aware of the stir she was causing. When she approached Miss Marple's table, she gave a little curtsy. "Miss Marple," she said with a sparkling smile, "you're quite the legend in this village." "Well," said Miss Marple mildly, "I dare say I've been here long enough to earn a few stories, though not all of them are worth repeating." The young woman laughed, a bright, chiming sound that somehow didn't ring quite true. "She has beautiful teeth," whispered Miss Weatherby to Miss Hinchcliffe as Verity moved off. "That usually means bad character." "Or money," Miss Hinchcliffe replied. "Often the same thing." The fete continued, raffles drawn, preserves sold, the children's three-legged race culminating in a small scandal when it was discovered that young Teddy Blackwell had tied his and his partner's legs together with fencing wire. But all things considered, it was a remarkably successful afternoon, until the scream. It came from the rose arbor at the far end of the vicarage lawn, sharp, unnatural, and very distinctly not the sound of someone who'd spilled jam. Miss Marple stood quickly, dropping her knitting into her handbag. Others were already rushing to the sound, the vicar's wife in her sensible heels, Colonel Melchett at an admirable jog, and poor Dr. Haydock muttering something about his bunions. Lying on the grass, half shaded by the climbing roses, was a Verity Hunt, very still, very pale, and unmistakably dead. There was no blood, no struggle, only the smallest of details. A single perfectly arranged bouquet of white orchids clutched in her hands, and a peculiar expression on her face. "She looks," someone whispered, "as if she's smiling." Miss Marple said nothing, but as the panic rippled across the fete, as neighbours began pointing fingers and the constable arrived in a breathless state of confusion, she looked down at the girl's serene face, eyes gently shut, lips faintly upturned. A bride, yes, but one who had, most curiously, smiled at her own funeral. The commotion stirred the garden like a stick through still water. Within minutes, the fete had unravelled. teacups abandoned mid-sip, cucumber sandwiches lying forgotten in napkins, and the band, sensing something was amiss, had gone quite silent. Whispers surged as villagers clustered in uneasy knots along the edge of the vicarage lawn. The roses swayed slightly in the breeze, their petals entirely too cheerful for the occasion. Miss Marple remained where she was for a moment, eyes fixed on the young woman's face. Verity Hunt, so vibrant an hour before, now lay in death with a composure that was at once serene and disquieting. That faint smile, a detail most would brush aside as poetic coincidence, but to Miss Marple, it was a pattern. And patterns, particularly in people, rarely appeared by accident. Dr. Haydock crouched beside the body, his moustache twitching with concentration. He opened one of Verity's eyes, checked her pulse, though the absence of life was already clear, and examined the bouquet in her hands. A strange, deliberate touch, that. "She's gone," he confirmed with gentle finality. "I'd say, within the last half hour, no visible injury." Miss Hartnell gasped, which seemed to satisfy her need for involvement. "Heart?" asked Colonel Melchett, who had taken charge in the way only retired military men could, by puffing up his chest and barking orders at nobody in particular. "Possibly, though she's far too young for it to have been natural," Dr. Haydock said. "No sign of trauma, but this smile, odd, very odd." "It's not poison?" asked Miss Marple softly, more to herself than to the group. Dr. Haydock looked up at her, an eyebrow lifting. "There are poisons that can cause a kind of rictus," he admitted. "Some alkaloids, maybe digitalis in certain doses. We'll know more after the post-mortem. But she wasn't in distress when she died. That's what's strange." "Strange, indeed." Miss Marple let her eyes wander across the gathered crowd, scanning faces not for grief. Most here had barely known Verity, but for guilt, fear, or the desperate calculation of someone already rewriting their version of the afternoon. The first to begin talking, of course, was Mrs. Crowcombe. "She was fine not 20 minutes ago," the woman wailed, fluttering an extravagant peacock-feathered fan, as if fanning could bring her niece back. She had 2 sips of lemonade and was laughing at that poor child's hideous hat. Verity didn't have enemies, surely. She was adored. "Miss..." Hinchcliffe snorted, not quietly. Miss Marple tucked her hands into her sleeves and listened. That was always her first step, just listening. Gossip, contrary to public belief, wasn't noise. It was music. Sometimes an aria of truth, with a harmony of self-interest. "She didn't seem herself," said Miss Weatherby, who had evidently appointed herself mistress of mood analysis. "All that smiling, it was forced, bright and brittle, like a cracked plate, you know." "Oh, don't be ridiculous," huffed Mrs. Price Ridley. "She was radiant. I rather thought she was showing off. Not that I blame her. That fiancé of hers, Jonathan Simmons, he's handsome and solvent." Miss Marple noted that. Simons had not yet arrived, though he'd been expected. "Odd that. She's been under." "Strain," said the vicar's wife, with the authority of someone who'd hosted Verity for tea precisely once. "Planning a wedding is no small task. I dare say she was run down." "Perhaps she had doubts about the marriage," Miss Marple offered gently, knitting needles moving slowly again, more out of habit than concentration. "Cold feet, as it were?" Mrs. Crowcombe looked offended. Verity was a romantic. She wrote poetry, for heaven's sake. If she had doubts, she never showed them. That was something too, when people protest what the dead wouldn't have done. It usually meant they had no idea what the dead had been doing. Colonel Melchett was summoning the local constable, young P.C. Ballard, who arrived out of breath, his notebook already open, as if he might contain chaos by writing it down. He took names, made clumsy apologies, and asked the garden party guests to remain nearby for statements. Miss Marple quietly removed herself from the gathering and wandered back to the refreshment table where the lemonade jug still stood, nearly full. She sniffed it delicately. No bitterness, no almond scent, no telltale signs. But she reached into her handbag and removed a clean linen handkerchief anyway, dabbing a bit of the liquid onto it, folding it away. No use waiting for science to do what observation might accomplish more quickly. From behind the trellised edge of the marquee, a figure emerged, young, pale, and drawn with obvious distress. Jonathan Simmons. He looked as if he'd sprinted across half the village. "I came as soon as I heard," he said breathlessly, making his way toward Mrs. Crocombe, whose theatrical collapse onto a wicker chair provided him an opportunity to look appropriately devastated. "She's gone," Mrs. Crocombe moaned. "My poor girl. She was your future, Jonathan. Your wife." Simons went very still. "Gone?" he repeated, his voice hollow. "What do you mean, gone?" And then for the first time his eyes found the small cluster at the rose arbor, and the truth settled across his face like a dark cloud. He stumbled forward, but Dr. Haydock intercepted him. "Don't touch the body," he said firmly. "We need to keep the scene uncontaminated." Miss Marple stepped beside him. She seemed, "Well, earlier?" she asked. "Happy?" Jonathan shook his head slowly. "I don't know. She was distracted. She said she wanted to talk this evening, that there were things she hadn't told me yet." "What sort of things?" "She didn't say. Only that it was important." Miss Marple gave the faintest nod. That fit. Too often those nearing death, by choice or arrangement, began tidying up their lives, like a housewife expecting company. But Miss Marple had seen too many tidy corpses to accept a death as simple. If Verity Hunt had secrets, then they hadn't died with her. Not yet. She returned to the lilac bush and sat once more, retrieving her knitting. The crowd was thinning, people being gently ushered home, but the ripple of unease remained. A bride dead 2 weeks before her wedding, a smile on her lips, a bouquet in her hands, and the lingering question, had Verity Hunt been killed for something she had done, or something she was going to? Miss Marple's needles moved with quiet rhythm as she pondered the difference. The village awoke the next morning as though nothing untoward had happened. The sun cast a gentle light over the neat cottages of St. Mary Mead. The church bells rang for Sunday service, and the scent of fresh bread mingled with the dew in the air. Yet beneath this familiar veneer, a subtle tension threaded through the streets and lanes. A hush had settled over the village, as though the villagers collectively held their breath, waiting for the day's events to unfold. Miss Marple, however, was not one to let the day's calm deceive her. Over her morning tea, she observed the world beyond her window, with the steady gaze of a woman accustomed to noticing the unnoticed. The post-mortem report, delivered by a letter from the local doctor, lay unopened on the table. She preferred to hear things first with her own eyes and ears, before allowing cold medical facts to dictate her thoughts. Later that morning, the vicar's wife called upon Miss Marple, her voice trembling as she relayed snippets of gossip that had already begun to spiral. "People are saying it might have been poisoning," she said, wringing her hands. "Some even think it was the fiancé's doing, though I can't believe Jonathan capable of such a thing." Miss Marple merely nodded. Accusations were like the village cat, willing to prowl and pounce before anyone quite knew what was happening. "I shall be seeing Jonathan today," she said, "and perhaps I will learn more." Walking through the village, Miss Marple noted faces, some open with sorrow, others tight with fear or calculation. At the village shop, Miss Hinchcliffe was murmuring loudly about Verity's hidden past, while at the post office, a letter from London hinted at a scandal too delicate to be spoken aloud. Everyone had a theory, and yet none seemed to fit neatly with the woman who had smiled in death. Arriving at the Simons family home, a modest but well-kept house on the village's edge, Miss Marple was greeted by Jonathan himself. He was pale, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness, but he offered her a faint smile of welcome. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "I don't know who else to turn to. The police are helpful in their way, but I feel they want to close the case before it's even begun." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Sometimes, Jonathan, the answers lie in the quiet spaces between questions." They sat in the parlour, surrounded by photographs of Verity, her radiant smile immortalized in every frame. Jonathan spoke carefully, recounting their time together, their plans, and the mysterious things Verity had wished to reveal. She was troubled, he admitted. Not with me, no, but with something she wouldn't say aloud, something she feared. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Did she mention anyone in particular? Jonathan shook his head. Only that there were shadows from her past she wanted to face before our wedding. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who had come to update them on the investigation. His expression was serious but measured. "We have a few leads," he said. "Verity's past engagement, as you know, was to Captain Edmund Carlyle. He disappeared in India some years ago, presumed dead. But we have reason to believe he might still be alive." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Indeed, that could explain much." As the inspector detailed the inquiries made, Miss Marple's mind pieced together fragments of conversation, glances exchanged, and the subtle inconsistencies in the villagers' stories. Later, walking back through the village, she noticed Mrs. Crocombe's house. The curtains were drawn tightly, and a faint strain of piano music floated out, a melancholy tune that spoke of regret and longing. Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued, but she resisted the urge to intrude. Instead, she visited the local bookstore, where Mr. Bloxam, the quiet owner, shared a recent discovery. Verity bought several books on exotic plants and poisons, he revealed. She seemed interested in something dangerous but beautiful. That detail settled uneasily in Miss Marple's mind. A bouquet of orchids at the fete, books on poisons, and a smile that belied death, each piece hinting at a carefully constructed puzzle. Returning home, Miss Marple sat by her window and reviewed her mental notes. There were too many questions without answers, too many secrets lurking beneath the village's quaint exterior. As twilight fell, she resolved to pay a visit to Captain Carlyle's last known contact, a retired army officer living quietly just beyond the village. Perhaps it was time to explore those shadows Verity had feared. In the calm of her sitting room, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily, weaving together threads of a mystery that was only just beginning to reveal its true shape. The day after Miss Marple's visit to Jonathan Simons passed with a curious mix of quiet unease and tentative activity. The village of St. Mary Mead was always a place where news travelled fast, but in the case of Verity Hunt's death, it seemed the villagers were caught between shock and speculation, neither fully able to face the truth nor willing to let it go. Miss Marple herself began the morning by walking toward the outskirts of the village, where Captain Edmund Carlyle's old friend, Major Henry Aldridge, now lived. Major Aldridge was a man who carried his years lightly. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his posture was that of a man who still commanded respect. The Major's home was a modest cottage, its garden wild with spring flowers and the faint scent of lavender. When Miss Marple arrived, she found Major Aldridge tending to a bed of primroses. His eyes, sharp beneath bushy eyebrows, lifted to greet her with polite surprise. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, "it's been many years since I've had visitors. What brings you out this way?" "I'm afraid it concerns a young woman who was once engaged to your friend Captain Carlyle," Miss Marple replied gently. "Verity Hunt. She died quite suddenly last week." The Major's face darkened. "Verity, poor girl. I'd heard rumours, but I hadn't imagined she was a spirited one." Miss Marple nodded, choosing her words carefully. There are suggestions that Captain Carlyle may still be alive, though presumed dead. Have you had any contact with him recently? Major Aldridge shook his head. No. Carlyle was always a restless soul. After the army, he disappeared to parts unknown. There were whispers, India, Africa, even South America. I last heard from him 5 years ago, said he was finding himself. Then nothing. I assumed the worst. Did Verity ever speak of him to you? Miss Marple asked. The Major hesitated. Not much. Only that she was engaged to him before meeting Jonathan Simmons. Something happened to Carlyle, something she never explained. Miss Marple's thoughts flickered. A secret kept for so long, now resurfaced like a submerged rock beneath calm waters. Thank you, Major. Your honesty is much appreciated. As she walked back toward the village, the gears of her mind began to turn. The possibility that Captain Carlyle was alive complicated matters. If Verity had feared him, or if he had returned, that could have brought danger not only to herself, but potentially to others as well. The village buzzed gently, with its usual weekday rhythms, but Miss Marple's path took her next to the modest bookshop, where Mr. Bloxham greeted her with a knowing smile. "You've been busy, Miss Marple," he remarked, stacking a new shipment of novels. "Did you want to see those books on exotic plants again?" "Yes, please," she said, accepting the small pile he handed her. The titles ranged from botany guides to obscure references on toxic flowers and poisonous orchids. She leafed through the pages carefully, noting particular passages marked with notes in Verity's neat handwriting. One caught her eye, a detailed description of the cymbidium orchid, prized for its beauty but known to contain mild toxins. The notes suggested an intimate knowledge of the plant's properties, how to extract its essence, how to disguise its scent. Miss Marple pondered this as she walked away. The bouquet of orchids in Verity's hands at the garden fete was no accident. Someone had chosen those flowers deliberately, and the connection to poison was too strong to ignore. Her next stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Crowcombe had resumed her daily routine with a fragile dignity. Miss Marple found her sitting by the window, staring into the garden as though seeking answers in the blooms. "Mrs. Crowcombe," Miss Marple began gently, "I wanted to ask about Verity's state of mind before the fete. Had she mentioned feeling threatened or uneasy?" The older woman shook her head, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "She was restless, yes. She confided in me once, though not about who or what troubled her. She spoke of shadows from her past, things she wished to leave behind but feared they would catch up with her." Miss Marple nodded, sensing layers beneath the words. "Did she mention anyone in particular?" "Only in whispers," Mrs. Crowcombe replied, glancing sideways, "and I promised not to say." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said softly, "the shadows can be chased away by light." Mrs. Crowcombe sighed and looked away. "I fear this light may reveal more than we wish to see." Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple's mind returned to the other villagers. The whispers and sideways glances at the shop, the quiet judgments masked as concern, all hinted at secrets tangled beneath the surface. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the soft glow casting shadows on her knitting. The pattern of events was becoming clearer, but no less troubling. Verity's past engagement, the mysterious Captain Carlyle, the bouquet of orchids, and the strange smile she wore in death all pointed to a carefully concealed truth. She resolved to speak next with Jonathan Simons again. There was a weight in his silence that needed lifting, and sometimes the unspoken spoke louder than any confession. The following morning, Jonathan greeted her with a guarded expression. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about Verity's things she wanted to tell me. I fear she was protecting someone, perhaps even herself, by keeping secrets from me." Did she ever mention Captain Carlyle to you? Miss Marple asked. Jonathan's face tightened. Once or twice. She was afraid of him, yes, but also afraid to speak ill. He was complicated. And have you heard anything recently of him? No, Jonathan said, until the inspector mentioned the possibility he might still be alive. It's unsettling. Miss Marple studied him quietly. Fear is a powerful thing, Jonathan. It can lead us to hide in plain sight, or to mask truth behind smiles. Before Jonathan could respond, a sharp knock at the door announced Inspector Craddock's arrival. His expression was grave. "We've received news from London," he began. "Captain Carlyle's name appeared in a recent inquiry about a forgery ring operating overseas. It's possible his disappearance was staged." The room fell silent. "Missy..." Marple's gaze narrowed thoughtfully. A staged disappearance, a return under suspicion, and a dead bride smiling at her own funeral, all threads in a web she was only just beginning to unravel. As Inspector Craddock left to pursue this new lead, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of anticipation. The village's quiet facade was fracturing, revealing a complex mosaic of fears, secrets, and lies. And at the center of it all was a truth waiting patiently to be uncovered. The news of Captain Carlyle's possible involvement in a forgery ring rippled through St. Mary Mead like a cold breeze cutting across a summer afternoon. Such a revelation was as unexpected as it was unsettling, and it cast a long shadow over the village's already fragile calm. Miss Marple, for her part, took the information in stride, though her mind churned quietly beneath the surface, turning over every nuance and whisper that had come her way. That afternoon, as the light waned and the village seemed to hold its breath, Miss Marple made her way once more to the Simons' residence. Jonathan greeted her at the door with an expression that betrayed more exhaustion than grief now, an almost hollow weariness that suggested the weight of suspicion was settling heavily upon him. "Thank you for coming again, Miss Marple," he said, leading her into the drawing room, where the photographs of Verity seemed to watch with silent accusation. "I'm not sure what to believe anymore. This news about Carlyle, it changes everything." Miss Marple settled into an armchair, folding her hands calmly. "Sometimes, Jonathan, it is the changes that reveal the truth rather than obscure it. Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual in Verity's behavior in the days before the fete? Anything out of place? Any visitors or letters?" Jonathan thought for a moment. "She received a letter just a few days before the wedding was called off. I never saw it, but she seemed troubled after reading it. She never told me who it was from." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did she destroy the letter or keep it?" "She locked it away in her writing desk. I tried to see it once, but she wouldn't allow it." That small detail gave Miss Marple a thread to pull on. "Would you mind if I looked at the desk, Jonathan? Sometimes objects can speak when words fail." Jonathan nodded, leading her to Verity's room. The desk was an elegant antique, its surface polished and arranged with the precision of someone who took great care in their personal effects. Miss Marple opened the drawer cautiously and found, beneath a scattering of papers, the locked letterbox. The key was absent, but the lock appeared old and fragile. With a practiced hand, Miss Marple managed to lift the delicate catch, revealing the contents. There lay the letter, its envelope stained with faint traces of perfume, and a hurried scrawl that bore a London address. She unfolded the note and read it quietly. The words were terse and threatening. "Your past is not as buried as you believe. Meet me at once, or all will be revealed." Miss Marple's gaze lifted. "This is very telling, Jonathan. Do you recognize the address?" He shook his head. "No, I don't." "Nor I," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "But it's a start. We shall have to inquire discreetly in London." Returning downstairs, Jonathan seemed weighed down by the revelation, but Miss Marple noticed a flicker of something else. Relief, perhaps, that the mystery was beginning to surface. Over. The next few days, the village's whispers grew louder and the police investigation deepened. Inspector Craddock's men made discreet inquiries in London about the forgery ring and the address on the letter. Meanwhile, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, piecing together fragments from conversations, glances, and evasions. One afternoon, as she strolled through the village, she paused outside the home of Mrs. Sylvia Hinchcliffe, known locally for her sharp tongue and sharper gossip. The woman's windows were wide open and Miss Marple caught snippets of a heated conversation inside. "You can't trust anyone these days," Mrs. Hinchcliffe was saying. "Not even those closest to you. That girl, Verity, she had secrets. Mark my words, there's more to her story than we know." Miss Marple entered, offering a polite smile. Mrs. Hinchcliffe's eyes lit up with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Miss Marple, do come in. I was just discussing the whole dreadful business. Can you imagine? A forgery ring and a bride dead before her wedding. This village will never be the same." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "Have you noticed anything unusual in the days before Verity's death?" Mrs. Hinchcliffe hesitated. "Only that Verity was not herself. She had visitors, strangers, I think, and she was always looking over her shoulder." That confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. Someone from Verity's past had come seeking her out, bringing with them threats too dark to face openly. That evening, as Miss Marple sat with her knitting, a visitor arrived, a slender, nervous woman who introduced herself as Miss Eleanor Carter, a close friend of Verity's from London. She had come with a suitcase and eyes filled with quiet determination. "I heard what happened," Miss Carter said softly, "and I think I can help." Over tea, Miss Carter revealed that Verity had confided in her about Captain Carlyle's connection to the forgery ring and his return to England under an assumed name. Verity was frightened, Eleanor admitted. She knew something that put her in danger. Miss Marple's mind turned over the implications. If Carlyle was involved in criminal dealings and Verity had discovered it, the motive for murder became clearer: protection of a secret, silencing the truth. But there was still the matter of the smile. Why had Verity smiled at her own funeral, as if mocking death itself? Miss Marple considered the possibility that Verity had anticipated the threat, perhaps even staged her own manner of death to send a message or buy time. The bouquet of orchids, the subtle poison references, all might have been part of a calculated plan to conceal the truth or to confuse the killer. As Miss Marple pondered this, a sudden thought struck her. If Verity had been clever enough to arrange such things, might she also have left a hidden clue among her belongings? The next morning, accompanied by Eleanor Carter, Miss Marple returned to Verity's room. They searched carefully through her personal effects, turning over books, letters, and trinkets. Finally, in the lining of an old leather-bound diary, Miss Marple found a small folded paper, a map of London marked with a single spot, a small square near the address on the threatening letter. "It seems Verity was planning to meet someone," Miss Marple said softly, "and perhaps to confront the past before it caught her." The plot was thickening, and the threads were beginning to tighten. The peaceful village was no longer a simple backdrop, but a stage for secrets, deception, and danger. Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and patient eyes, was closer than ever to unraveling the truth, though the final act was still hidden behind a veil of smiles and shadows. Miss Marple set out for London the next morning, accompanied by Eleanor Carter, whose knowledge of the city and past connections to Verity promised to be invaluable. The village was waking up beneath a grey sky, the soft drizzle making the familiar cottages seem almost muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation. As they boarded the train, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back over the tangled threads she had gathered so far: Captain Carlyle's shadowy past, the threatening letter, the hidden map. The picture was far from complete, but a pattern was emerging, faint but undeniable. Once in London, Eleanor led Miss Marple to a modest building in a less fashionable part of town, just off a narrow cobbled street. The square marked on the map was a quiet courtyard surrounded by old brick buildings, their windows grimy with years of neglect. It was here, Eleanor explained, that Verity had arranged to meet someone she believed might hold the key to her past and perhaps her fate. They waited discreetly in the nearby cafe, sipping tea as the clock ticked away the minutes. Miss Marple's keen eyes scanned the faces that passed by, noting the weary commuter, the shopkeeper wiping down a storefront, the woman in a dark coat whose glance lingered a moment too long. It was a place where secrets might hide in plain sight. Just as the hour approached, a man appeared at the far end of the courtyard. A tall figure with a deliberate gait, his face partially obscured by the brim of a worn hat. Eleanor stiffened. "That's him," she whispered. "I recognize the way he moves. It's Marcus Flynn, one of Carlyle's known associates. Dangerous man." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. If Verity met with him, she must have been searching for answers, or perhaps trying to negotiate. Suddenly the man glanced around, his eyes flicking toward the cafe where they sat. He hesitated, then turned and disappeared down a side alley. Eleanor's face paled. "He's suspicious. We should follow." The two women left the cafe with quiet purpose, keeping to the shadows as they trailed Marcus Flynn through twisting lanes and over a footbridge that arched above the Thames. Flynn moved with practiced stealth, but Miss Marple's steady pace never faltered. At last he entered a nondescript building marked only by a faded sign, the Raven Club. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the murmur of low voices. Flynn disappeared into the back rooms. Miss Marple and Eleanor exchanged a glance before slipping inside. The dim light revealed a room cluttered with tables, a jukebox in the corner, and a few patrons nursing drinks. They found a secluded spot and waited. Moments later, the door creaked open, and a man in a dark suit entered, a sharp contrast to Flynn's rugged appearance. His eyes scanned the room until they rested on Flynn, who approached cautiously. Miss Marple listened closely, though the conversation was muffled. Words like shipment, cover, and disappearance floated through. It was clear Flynn and this man were discussing plans to evade detection, possibly connected to the forgery ring. Eleanor leaned in. If Carlyle is involved, these men are his associates. Verity must have uncovered something dangerous. As the meeting ended and the men departed, Miss Marple's attention shifted to the back of the room, where a small bulletin board held a series of photographs and notes, an apparent ledger of suspects and contacts. One photo caught her eye. A grainy image of Captain Carlyle, younger but unmistakable, standing beside a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Verity. Beneath it, scrawled in faded ink, was a note. The bride who smiled at her own funeral. Too clever by half. The word sent a chill through Miss Marple. Was this some kind of message or warning? Had Verity played a role deeper than anyone, suspected, perhaps outwitting her pursuers until the very end? They left the club quickly, the weight of discovery heavy but tempered by new questions. On the train back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the tangled web that now spanned from the quiet village to the shadowed corners of London. Back home, the village seemed even quieter, the air thick with apprehension. Miss Marple arranged to meet Inspector Craddock at the vicarage, where the two would exchange information and compare notes. Craddock greeted her with a grim nod. "The men you saw at the Raven Club have links to several crimes across the country. If Carlyle's involved, it means this case is far bigger than a simple murder," Miss Marple agreed. "It appears so, Inspector, but the motive remains close to home, the betrayal, the secrets that led to Verity's death. As evening fell over St. Mary Mead, the village lights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the lanes and gardens. Miss Marple stood by her window, watching the world she knew transform beneath a veil of mystery. She knew the truth was near, concealed in the faces and stories of those around her, and when it came to light, it would be with the quiet certainty that only Miss Marple's gentle but relentless mind could deliver. The morning after her return from London, Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to the garden of the Simmons residence, where Jonathan paced restlessly, the weight of his family's unravelling future etched across his face. The village's uneasy calm had been shattered, and now the undercurrents of suspicion and fear ran deeper than ever. "Jonathan," Miss Marple began gently, "I think it is time we spoke frankly about your late sister's relationships in the village. Sometimes the closest ties conceal the sharpest motives." Jonathan paused, his gaze drifting to the flower beds where the remnants of the funeral wreath still lingered. "Verity was complicated," he admitted. "She had friends, but also enemies, though I never imagined any would go so far as to kill." Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "Did she have any quarrels with anyone recently? Disputes that might seem trivial, but beneath the surface held a deeper significance?" Jonathan thought for a moment. "There was some tension with Mrs. Edith Blake, the owner of the village bookstore. They had a disagreement about a rare book Verity was keen to acquire for her collection. It seemed small, but I noticed Verity was troubled afterward." "That is helpful," Miss Marple replied. "Small quarrels often disguise larger rifts." She set off toward the bookstore, a quaint and dusty little place that smelled of old paper and wood polish. Mrs. Blake was behind the counter when Miss Marple arrived, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a wary expression. "Good morning, Mrs. Blake," Miss Marple greeted her kindly. "I wondered if you might tell me more about your disagreement with Verity." Mrs. Blake's lips tightened. It was about a first edition of a local poet's work. Verity wanted it badly. I refused to sell. It belonged to my late husband's collection, and I wasn't ready to part with it. She took it badly, left in a huff. "Did it seem more than a simple quarrel?" Miss Marple pressed. Mrs. Blake sighed. "Perhaps. Verity was always passionate, sometimes stubborn, but I never thought it would lead to this." Leaving the bookstore, Miss Marple reflected on how often the outwardly trivial masked deeper resentments. The quarrel was petty, but what if it was merely the surface of something more sinister? Back in the village square, gossip had begun to swirl anew, and Miss Marple caught snatches of conversations as she passed. "I heard Verity was involved in more than just the forgery case," whispered one elderly woman to another. "Some say she was blackmailing people." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Blackmail. It was a serious accusation. But in the village's tight-knit social circles, secrets were currency, and fear often bred such rumours. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where she found the Reverend James at his desk, deep in contemplation. "Reverend, might I ask if you noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the tragedy?" she inquired gently. The Reverend nodded slowly. Verity was a regular attendee at the evening prayers, but she seemed distracted. More than once she left abruptly during the service. "Did she mention why?" "No, but she spoke privately with several parishioners, sometimes in hushed tones. I had the impression she was burdened with a secret." Miss Marple made a mental note of the parishioners. Secrets rarely stayed hidden in a village where everyone knew everyone else's business, yet people spoke carefully. That evening, as twilight settled, Miss Marple invited Eleanor Carter to join her for a walk around the village. They passed familiar cottages and winding lanes, the air fragrant with honeysuckle and damp earth. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Verity's smile at her funeral, the bouquet of orchids, these were deliberate acts, She knew her death would be tragic, yet she chose to face it with a knowing calm. Eleanor nodded, almost as if she wanted to send a message. But to whom? That is the question, Miss Marple replied. Perhaps the message was intended for the very person who silenced her. As they spoke, a sudden movement caught Miss Marple's eye, a shadow slipping into the narrow lane near the old mill. She paused, her instincts alert. "Did you see that?" she asked Eleanor. "Yes, someone is watching." They followed cautiously, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot betraying their approach. At the edge of the lane, a figure darted behind a hedge. Miss Marple called softly, "Come now, there's no need for secrets." The figure hesitated before stepping into the open. It was a young man, eyes wide with fear. "Please," he said hurriedly. "I didn't mean to scare anyone. I know things about Verity. Things that could help." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "Then speak freely. We must uncover the truth." He introduced himself as Thomas Green, a local gardener who had often worked at the Simons estate. Verity was frightened, more than anyone realized. "She told me she was being followed. Someone wanted her to disappear." "Did she say why?" "No, but she showed me a letter, threatening like the one you found. She didn't want the police involved, feared the village would be torn apart." Miss Marple's mind raced. The deeper she delved, the more she saw how entwined the village was in a web of fear and deceit. That night, as the village lay under a blanket of fog, Miss Marple sat by her fire, turning over every piece of the puzzle. Each new confession, every whispered secret, revealed another facet of the story, a story of betrayal, danger, and the lengths people would go to protect themselves. She knew the answers lay not in the forgeries or the London shadows alone, but here in St. Mary Mead, among the familiar faces and whispered conversations. The smile of the bride at her own funeral was a riddle, an unspoken challenge to those who thought they had the truth. Miss Marple was determined to meet it, patiently unravelling the layers until the final, quiet revelation could be made. The following morning, Miss Marple rose early, the chill of dawn lingering in the air as she prepared for a day that promised new revelations. The village, still shrouded in a mist that softened its familiar outlines, held its breath with an unspoken tension. Though the usual hum of daily life began to stir, the shadow of Verity's death stretched long and dark over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple decided her first visit should be to the Simons household once more, seeking to speak again with Jonathan, whose burden seemed to grow heavier by the day. Upon arrival, she found him in the library, a room lined with books and scattered papers, the remnants of Verity's once vibrant life now tinged with sorrow. "Jonathan," she greeted gently, "I trust you are managing as well as one can in such circumstances." He offered a tired smile. "I'm trying, Miss Marple, though it's not easy. Verity's disappearance, and now her death. It's left so many unanswered questions. I imagine you must have thought more about her acquaintances here." "In the village?" "Yes, and also about those from her past. There are people who resented her, not just here, but beyond." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "The letter you mentioned, do you recall any detail about its delivery?" "The handwriting or the scent of the paper, perhaps?" Jonathan paused. "It was written in a hurried scrawl, on cream stationery, and there was a faint scent of lavender, oddly enough." "That is curious," Miss Marple mused. "Lavender is common in the village, but combined with hurried writing, it suggests the sender was anxious but wanted to convey a particular impression." Before Jonathan could respond, the door opened and Eleanor Carter stepped inside, her expression serious. "Miss Marple, I've spoken with a few people in London. The forgery ring seems to have deeper connections than we first thought. Some of the names linked to Carlyle's associates appear in police reports concerning art thefts across Europe." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Then Verity was entangled in matters far beyond our village. Eleanor nodded. And there's more. The woman in the photograph you noticed at the Raven Club, the one standing beside Carlyle, has been identified. Her name is Marianne Graves, an art dealer with a dubious reputation. Have you found any connection between Marianne Graves and Verity? Miss Marple inquired. Indirectly, Eleanor replied. Marianne was known to deal in stolen artifacts and had dealings with several London galleries. Verity was attempting to expose her. Miss Marple considered this. So Verity's knowledge threatened powerful people, both local and distant. Jonathan sighed. It seems Verity's smile at the funeral was her final act of defiance. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. The village constable, Peterson, entered with a folded letter in hand. Miss Marple, this was left at the vicarage this morning. No name or address. Miss Marple carefully unfolded the paper. The message was brief, written in the same hurried script as the threatening letter. Stop digging, or you will be the next to smile at your own funeral. A cold silence filled the room. Eleanor exchanged a worried glance with Miss Marple. The game had grown more dangerous. Determined to press further, Miss Marple and Eleanor arranged to visit Marianne Graves's gallery, a discreet establishment nestled in a narrow London street. Upon arrival, they were greeted by a sleek, composed woman with an air of calculated charm. Miss Marple, Miss Carter, Marianne said smoothly. To what do I owe the pleasure? Miss Marple returned her gaze evenly. Miss Graves, I'm afraid. Your name has come up in connection with the recent tragedy in St. Mary Mead. Verity Simons was investigating your dealings. Marianne's eyes flickered briefly with something like irritation before masking it with a polite smile. Verity was ambitious but naive. I assure you I had nothing to do with her death. But you were aware of her inquiries? Miss Marple pressed. I prefer to keep my business discreet, Marianne replied. Curious questions can be dangerous. Miss Marple noted the subtle tension beneath the surface and decided to change her approach. Discretion is wise, but so is honesty. If Verity's death can be prevented from becoming another unsolved mystery, it serves everyone's interest. Marianne regarded her silently for a moment, then nodded. Very well. There is someone you should speak to, Victor Hargreaves. He handled some of the more sensitive transactions for me. He might know more. With the name, Miss Marple felt a thread pulling tighter around the heart of the mystery. Returning to St. Mary Mead late that evening, the weight of the day settled around her like a cloak. The village was quiet, but Miss Marple knew beneath the surface tensions simmered, and someone was watching. She found herself drawn to the vicarage again, where Reverend James welcomed her with concern. Miss Marple, I fear the village is fracturing. People are afraid to speak openly. Fear is a potent silencer, she agreed, but secrets only fester when left unchecked. As they talked, the Reverend revealed that Victor Hargreaves was once a resident of St. Mary Mead, before relocating to London several years ago. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the connections. Victor's presence here was no coincidence. The web of deception was close to home. That night, as the village lay under a blanket of fog, Miss Marple sat by her fire, turning over every detail. The letter's scent of lavender, the forbidding warnings, the shadows from London, all pointed to a larger conspiracy rooted in both places. The smile Verity wore at her funeral was not just defiance. It was a final message, a challenge to those who believed they had silenced her. Miss Marple knew the next step was to confront Victor Hargreaves, to draw him out and watch for the flicker of guilt or fear. But in a village like St. Mary Mead, where everyone carried their own secrets, the truth would come slowly, and the shadows would lengthen before the dawn. The following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead awoke under a pall of mist that clung to the trees and softened the edges of cottages and lanes. The usual sounds, chatter, birdsong, the clinking of teacups, felt muted, as if the very air held its breath. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night turning the pieces of the puzzle over in her mind, prepared to meet the next thread in this tangled skein, Victor Hargreaves. Victor's former residence, a modest but well-kept house on the village's outskirts, had been empty for some time, yet Miss Marple was certain he still visited on occasion. With Eleanor Carter accompanying her, she set off through the dew-soaked fields, the dampness soaking their shoes as they approached the house. The garden was overgrown now, with wild roses choking the borders, but the windows gleamed as if someone cared enough to keep them clean. Miss Marple rapped gently on the door. There was a pause, then it creaked open, revealing a man with sharp features and guarded eyes. He was younger than she had imagined, though the weariness in his expression betrayed a life not without its burdens. "Mr. Hargreaves, I presume?" Miss Marple began, her tone calm but firm. "Yes. And you are?" he asked, stepping aside to allow them entry. "Miss Marple, of St. Mary Mead, and this is Miss Carter. We wish to speak with you about Verity Simmons." At the mention of Verity's name, Victor's eyes flickered. A brief shadow crossed his face before he composed himself. "I heard about her. Tragic business." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "We understand you had dealings with Marianne Graves, the art dealer in London. Could you tell us more about your relationship with her?" Victor hesitated, then nodded. "Marianne and I worked together on some transactions, acquisitions, some of them less than above board. Verity got wind of our dealings and was asking questions she shouldn't have." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Did you try to dissuade her?" He laughed bitterly. "I tried, but Verity was determined. She thought she could outsmart us. She was naive." "Do you think anyone else might have wanted to silence her?" Eleanor interjected. Victor looked away, then back, weighing his words carefully. "There's someone else, Charles Renwick. He was involved in the ring, but when things started to unravel, he grew fearful. Verity threatened to expose him." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Where can we find Mr. Renwick?" Victor shrugged. "He's been laying low since the funeral. Last I heard, he was staying at the old mill cottage." Miss Marple and Eleanor exchanged a glance. The mill cottage was familiar. It was isolated, a place where secrets could hide in shadows. They left Victor's house with more questions than answers, but a clearer direction. The web was spreading, and the strands led now to Charles Renwick. Later that day, Miss Marple and Eleanor visited the mill cottage. The sun had broken through the mist, casting a soft light over the rippling fields. The cottage was weathered, its shutters closed tight as if to keep out the world. Miss Marple knocked firmly, then waited. After a long pause, the door opened just a crack, revealing a gaunt man with restless eyes. Charles Renwick. "Mr. Renwick?" Miss Marple began gently, scowled but stepped aside. "What do you want?" "We need to talk about Verity Simmons and the trouble surrounding her death." Charles's jaw tightened. "I had nothing to do with it. She was a fool, meddling in things she didn't understand." "But you feared her knowledge," Miss Marple countered softly. "Enough to avoid the village since the funeral." He looked away, the tension in his shoulders betraying his facade. "I wanted to protect myself, nothing more." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Protection sometimes comes at a price, Mr. Renwick, and silence can be more dangerous than speaking. Out." The man's eyes flickered with something like desperation. "There's more to this than you know. Verity's death isn't just about forgeries or threats. It's about betrayal, deep and personal." "Would you care to explain?" Eleanor asked. Charles swallowed hard. Verity was involved with someone here in the village, someone no one suspects. Their past is tangled with hers in ways that could ruin reputations. Miss Marple's interest piqued. Do you mean someone connected to the Simons family? Charles nodded reluctantly. Yes, it's complicated, but it ties back to an old scandal, one that Verity uncovered and threatened to expose. The puzzle pieces were shifting. Miss Marple thanked Charles and left with Eleanor, the weight of his confession settling heavily between them. As they walked back through the village, Miss Marple pondered the layers of secrecy that cloaked the village like a fog. Verity's life and death had exposed more than a criminal enterprise. It had ripped open wounds that ran deep through old friendships and long-buried grudges. That evening, back at her own cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, piecing together the threads. The seemingly innocuous quarrels, the whispered threats, the clandestine meetings, all were part of a tapestry of human frailty and ambition. She recalled the orchids from Verity's funeral, their delicate beauty a stark contrast to the darkness surrounding her death. They were a message, a final act of courage from a woman who had smiled at her own funeral to challenge those who thought they had silenced her. Miss Marple knew the climax of this mystery was near. The next steps would require careful psychological navigation, subtle probing of suspects, and keen observation of the reactions that truth provoked. In the village that evening, as lamps flickered in windows and curtains twitched behind closed doors, Miss Marple understood that every glance, every whispered word could reveal the final secret. The real murderer was watching, waiting, and she intended to draw them out with a delicate game of wit and patience. For in St. Mary Mead, appearances deceived, and only the most perceptive eye could see the deadly truth lurking just beneath the surface. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in her drawing room, the firelight casting gentle shadows that flickered like whispers across the walls. She sipped her tea with the deliberate calm of one who has seen much of human nature and knows that, beneath the surface of village civility, the currents of jealousy, fear, and hidden resentments run deep and swift. Tonight, those currents felt stronger than ever. Her thoughts turned to the revelations of the day. Victor Hargreaves, Charles Renwick, Marianne Graves, each a piece of the puzzle, each bearing a fragment of the truth that, when assembled, might reveal the killer. But it was the insinuation that the murderer might be someone closer to home, someone whose very presence was woven into the fabric of St. Mary Mead, that gave Miss Marple the sharpest edge of curiosity. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. It was Eleanor Carter, looking both determined and troubled. Miss Marple, I thought you might like to know. I spoke to Jonathan Simmons again today. There's something he didn't mention before, something about his family's past. Miss Marple gestured for Eleanor to sit beside her. Do tell. He admitted there was a long-standing feud between his family and the Whitcomb family. Apparently, Verity had been investigating old grievances, disputes over property and inheritance that go back decades. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That could certainly add motive for someone to wish her silence. But it's more than that, Eleanor added, lowering her voice. Jonathan mentioned that Verity's investigations threatened to expose not only financial secrets but personal scandals, affairs, betrayals, things that would tarnish the village's genteel reputation. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, the veneer of respectability. How fragile it is when scratched. The next morning, Miss Marple set out with Eleanor to visit the Whitcomb estate, a sprawling manor on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and guarded by an air of unapproachable wealth. They were received by Margaret Whitcomb, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, whose demeanour was both proud and reserved. We understand you had some history with the Simmons family, Miss Marple began delicately. Perhaps you can shed light. On Verity's investigations, Margaret's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. History, yes, but I see no reason to dwell on old disputes. The past is best left buried. Yet Verity believed otherwise, Eleanor pressed. She thought there were truths that needed revealing. Margaret sighed, a flicker of regret crossing her face. If only she had known what she was stirring. My family has secrets, certainly, but they are not for public consumption. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Secrets often have a way of coming to light, Mrs. Whitcomb. Margaret's expression hardened. Then perhaps it's fortunate Verity is no longer here to pry. As they took their leave, Eleanor whispered, "She seems defensive." Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Defensiveness can be a shield, or a confession in disguise. Back in the village, rumours swirled like autumn leaves caught in the wind. The air was thick with whispered speculations, and Miss Marple sensed the village was inching closer to breaking point. It was time to observe more closely, to listen not just to words, but to silences and glances, the subtle language that often spoke the loudest. At the village shop, she watched as Mrs. Baker, the long-time shopkeeper, exchanged furtive glances with a young woman who had recently arrived in St. Mary Mead. Their brief, nervous smiles told Miss Marple there was a story there, perhaps another piece of the wider tapestry. Later that day, Miss Marple invited Jonathan Simmons for tea. The young man arrived, weary but composed, and they spoke quietly in the sitting room. "Jonathan," she began, "I understand Verity's investigation stirred more than a little trouble. Do you think her death was meant to protect these secrets?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "I do. I believe someone wanted to prevent her from revealing the truth about the Simons-Whitcomb feud and other matters. She was too close." "Did Verity leave any notes or clues for you to follow?" Miss Marple asked gently. He hesitated, then produced a small folded piece of paper from his pocket. "She gave me this the night before the funeral. She said it might help if anything happened to her." Unfolding the note, Miss Marple found a list of names, several from the village, some from London, and a phrase written in Verity's neat handwriting. "The truth lies where shadows gather." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with recognition. "A riddle worthy of your aunt." Jonathan smiled faintly. She always liked puzzles. That evening, as dusk deepened, Miss Marple wandered through the village square, pondering the riddle. Shadows gathered indeed, in alleys, behind closed doors, within the hearts of those around her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden arrival of Constable Peterson, breathless and anxious. "Miss Marple, you'll want to see this. There's been another incident." They hurried to the vicarage, where Eleanor was already speaking with a distraught Reverend James. A window had been broken, and a threatening message scrawled across the wooden sill. "Stop your prying, or next time it won't be just words." In the Dow, village's fragile peace shattered further, and Miss Marple's resolve hardened. The killer was growing bolder, desperate to maintain their facade of innocence. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple prepared for the next phase, a subtle, psychological test to draw the murderer out. She knew the murderer watched her, feared her insight, and with patience and quiet observation, she would make them reveal themselves. Tomorrow she would visit the village hall for the monthly committee meeting, a perfect stage to observe reactions, to engage suspects in casual conversation, and to watch for the telltale flicker of guilt. For in St. Mary Mead, beneath polite smiles and courteous nods, the real story waited to be uncovered. And Miss Marple, with her gentle, unassuming manner and keen eye for human nature, was ready to uncover it all. The village hall was quietly buzzing with the low hum of conversation when Miss Marple entered, her eyes quietly scanning the room. The monthly committee meeting was well underway, but beneath the chatter and polite exchanges, the tension was palpable, like a string stretched taut, ready to snap. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her gaze lingering thoughtfully on the faces before her. Among them were Jonathan Simmons, his expression guarded, Margaret Whitcomb, whose sharp eyes rarely missed a detail, Victor Hargreaves, nursing a quiet resentment, and Charles Renwick, who seemed notably restless. As the meeting progressed, Miss Marple observed more than she listened, watching the subtle exchanges, the fleeting glances, the nervous gestures. Each person carried a burden of unease that the murder had only intensified. Then, with gentle timing, she rose to speak, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of quiet authority. Friends, this village has been shadowed by grief and suspicion these past weeks. But grief must give way to truth, for only truth can bring peace. She paused, letting the silence deepen, then continued. Verity Simons was a woman of courage, who sought to expose what others wished to keep hidden. It is clear now that her death was no accident, but a calculated act to silence her. A faint murmur ran through the room, eyes shifting uneasily. "Consider the clues," Miss Marple said. "The forged paintings, the old family feud, the threats, and the message. The truth lies where shadows gather. Shadows gather, not in the streets, but in hearts cloaked by pretense and pride." Her gaze settled on Margaret Whitcomb. "Mrs. Whitcomb, your defensiveness hinted at deeper secrets. You feared exposure, did you not? Verity's investigations threatened the Whitcomb legacy." Margaret's composure cracked for a moment, but she remained silent. Miss Marple then addressed Charles Renwick. "You admitted your involvement in illicit dealings and feared Verity's knowledge. Yet fear alone does not lead to murder." Her eyes softened as she turned toward Victor Hargreaves. "Victor, you attempted to deter Verity, perhaps out of loyalty to old friends or self-preservation. But that is not the end of the story." She finally looked to Jonathan Simons. "Jonathan, your family's past intertwines with Verity's fate more closely than you imagined. You inherited not only secrets but burdens of silence." Jonathan's breath hitched, and he took a step forward. I didn't kill her. I wanted to protect my family's name, but I would never harm Verity." Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, Jonathan, you are not the one." She then drew a folded envelope from her handbag. "This letter was found in Verity's belongings, never shared until now. It reveals the true motive and the murderer's hand." As she read aloud, the room grew still. "I cannot allow you to destroy what my family has built. If you go forward with your plans, I will stop you, by any means necessary." Miss Marple looked around, her gaze landing on a figure who had remained quiet, Eleanor Carter. "Miss Carter," she said softly, "you came to St. Mary Mead under the guise of an ally, but your presence was not accidental." Eleanor's face flushed, her calm unraveling. "You don't understand." Miss Marple raised a hand. "I understand more than you think. You knew of Verity's investigations through your family ties and sought to protect them. The threats, the intimidation, even the broken window at the vicarage, all attempts to frighten, to stop the truth." Eleanor's resolve faltered. "Verity was going too far. She endangered us all. I only wanted to protect what was left." "And yet," Miss Marple said quietly, "you underestimated Verity's courage and the consequences of silencing her." The confession came quietly, the village holding its breath as justice found its voice. Eleanor Carter, protector of secrets, was unmasked as the one who had delivered death cloaked in a smile. As the constables took her away, Miss Marple turned to the assembled villagers. "Remember, the true mystery is not only who did this, but why. It is the frailty of human nature, the desire to protect at all costs, that leads us down dark paths." Days later, St. Mary Mead returned to its tranquil rhythms, though the shadow of the tragedy lingered like a whispered warning. Miss Marple sat by her fire, reflecting on the delicate balance between appearance and reality. In the end, it was not just a matter of crime and punishment, but a quiet understanding of the human heart, its secrets, its fears, and its occasional tragic failures. And with that understanding, Miss Marple found a bittersweet comfort, knowing that even in the smallest village the truth, like a flower, would bloom, sometimes late, but always with quiet grace.